And time to focus in on that book that I promised you in the previous hour. William Henry Krom Hendricks was the first sportsman to be formally barred from representing South Africa on the basis of race. Hailing from Cape Town's Bo-Kaap, he played in 1892 for the South African Malay team against the touring English, who insisted that he was among the best fast bowlers in the world. This made his exclusion from South Africa's tour of England in 1894 and subsequent test series all the more unjust. His story has been researched and told in the new book, Too Black to Wear White. Authors Jonty Winch and Richard Parry join me now from the Seapoint studio. A very good morning and welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Jonty, this is not the first book that you guys have worked on together. You worked together on Cricket and Society. Why tell the story of Krom Hendricks?
The story of Krom Hendricks begins in 1892, as you say. That was when the English came across him and found him frighteningly fast. Bill Murdoch, the Australian captain, was on that tour and rated him as good as the demon, Fred Spotforth, who was Australia's great fast bowler of the late 19th century. So that opened up the interest in Hendricks, and the newspaper reporter, Harry Cadwallader, took up the story and published a nominated side to tour England in 1894, setting about a great debate on the whether to pick him or not.
Richard, we'll speak a little bit more about Krom, but I just want to know, this is obviously, we're talking about people that lived many, many years ago. So Richard, how did you guys actually go about compiling all this historical data?
Yes, it was an interesting task. In fact, we focused primarily on newspapers at the time. The issue was really who Krom Hendricks was and identifying him. The cricket world had been aware of the existence of this rather legendary player, but in fact no one knew anything about him at all. They simply knew that he was somebody who'd been barred from playing for South Africa, but they had no idea of the human being and the life behind it. So we decided that what we needed to do was to find him, put him in his context, his socio-political context, and in order to do that, we began essentially by looking at newspaper reports. We also tried to track his genealogy, his descendants, through genealogical sources and sites, and we looked for whatever background archival material we could find. But it was looking for a needle in a haystack to begin with. But fortunately, the newspaper records were fairly full of Hendricks. In fact, Hendricks was discussed more often than just about any other cricketer in Southern Africa in the 1890s, remarkably, even though he never had the opportunity to play for South Africa or Western Province.
Just explain that for us, Jonty, how he was barred. If this was a man that was spoken about more than any other cricketer at the time, I mean, how did he never represent South Africa at the time?
Well, he originally was nominated by the Transvaal Cricket Union to be a member of the 1894 side to tour England. Milton, however, was involved with the political side. Milton was also the captain at the time. He wouldn't captain them on the tour. He was the head selector of the tour team, and he was also Cecil John Rhodes's right-hand man. He was head of the Prime Minister's department, and he had a chat with Rhodes, and they decided that Hendricks, it would be inappropriate to send Hendricks on the trip, and there was an outcry amongst the South African press as well as overseas. How can you not select our best fast bowler to go on this trip? But Milton remained adamant that they would not select him. Rhodes was kept out of it. It was only much later that it was discovered that Rhodes was involved in this particular tour. That was the first time. There would be further occasions when he was selected for representative teams.
Why did this public pressure then never end in him actually representing South Africa, Richard?
Well, ultimately what it was down to was a matter of South African identity. And at the time, the whole movement towards segregating South Africa along racial lines was gathering pace. with the development of the mining industry in the Transvaal and with the development of the economy in Cape Town and the relationship between Cecil Rhodes and Jan Hofmeyr and the Afrikaner Bonds. And what happened then as a result of that was a hardening of attitudes along racial lines, an idea in Rhodes's head and in the head of Milton and the Cape establishment that to be South African, you had to be white. And it was that defined your ability to represent South Africa. There was some discussion of Hendricks going on this tour as a baggage master to demonstrate his subservient status. But even that, it didn't work out. Hendricks himself refused to take that option. And in any event, it was unlikely to be accepted. So the idea was to draw lines between race and class and to draw them in a much more formal way that had been done before, which is why this is the beginning and the origins of segregation in South African sport and effectively part of the movement towards segregation in South Africa in general.
It's absolutely incredible. Very early on in the book, Jonty, you guys mentioned that sport played an important political and social role for the empire and maintaining what they wanted to achieve. Can you explain this a little bit further?
Yes. At that time, there was a call for South Africa to become involved within the empire in sport. There was a call for both rugby and cricket teams to travel overseas. The Australians had already been and made an impact across there. The 1894 tour was something of a disaster. It wasn't such a disaster by the playing record. They actually had a relatively good playing record. But Milton had instructed the captain, Herbert Carstens, not to talk to the press. And as a result of Carstens ignoring the press, they tended to ignore the South African cricket side. And as a result, there was very little publicity, there was poor weather, and it was they made a huge financial loss. So much so that they had to contact South Africans living over there to actually bail them out of the difficult position that they were in. So it was an embarrassing start to South Africa's cricket involvement within the empire at that stage.
Richard, what was the most interesting fact that you uncovered in actually researching this book?
Well, I think the most interesting thing for me was Krom Hendricks' life itself. Krom Hendricks was a hero. He was an exceptional cricketer. His statistics are really quite astonishing. When he got the opportunity to play against regular establishment or white cricket teams and the best cricketers in South Africa, his abilities as a cricketer meant that he was able to absolutely destroy them. In the context of that, for example, he played a game against Claremont when he took when his figures were 9 overs, 9 maidens, no runs, and 9 wickets. So 9 wickets for no runs. He was an exceptional cricketer, and I think that was probably the most interesting thing to start with. But the really interesting thing was in the context of that was the way in which Hendricks' life was extremely complex, on the borderline between the racial divide. He had a highly responsible position as an engine driver and later became a clerk in the Table Bay Harbour Board. His involvement with his family meant that at various times in his life he was treated from the point of view of work, occasionally as white in terms of the job color bar which existed at the time. At other times, of course, he was treated as coloured or Malay, as they were both called at the time, because of his antecedents in the Cape Malay community in Bo-Kaap. So it was all about ambiguity and the ambiguity of Krom Hendricks' position. But all through that, and right through to 1917, he continued to play cricket, and he played it for the love of the game, despite having the opportunities of fame and the glory that would have come from that being cruelly snatched away from him by a racist system. He still managed to maintain his dignity and his respect in the context of that. So that was the most interesting thing about it, was him himself and his personality, I think, for me.
It's amazing how you guys were able to uncover this hero who had 11 children. One of his grandsons actually played for Liverpool, and just giving us a little bit more of an idea about this man, and as you say, rather complex history of Krom Hendricks, as well as a societal snapshot in the 19th century of what it actually was like to play sport in South Africa. So it's so much more than just about sport. Thank you to both of you. All the best of luck with the book. That's Jonty Winch and Richard Parry. They've just released this new book, Too Black to Wear White. Thank you so much for chatting to us from our Seapoint studio.